Ronnie had a big cutthroat razor, and just as deliberately as any surgeon would wield a scalpel, sliced him down both cheeks.
In 1970, double killer Norman Parker arrived at Parkhurst Prison, home to some of Britain's most violent inmates, including both Ronnie and Reggie Kray, who, like Norman, were in prison for murder.
I knew I was going to be found guilty. I was, what they say, banged to rights.
Norman Parker spent 24 years inside Britain's toughest jails, with some of the country's most notorious criminals and gangsters, like the great train robbers and Frankie Fraser.
I suppose for the vast majority of prisoners, the worst day is the day they get sentenced. But not necessarily so, because I knew I was an accident looking for a place to happen. It was very, very inevitable. So to me, it was like any other day. The trial come to the end, I knew I was going to get life imprisonment.
I was in a particularly troublesome phase and I was moved around. I was involved in riots and escapes and other acts of violence. And I got thrown out of Wormwood Scrubs prison and I ended up in Parkhurst Prison. At the time, Ronnie and Reggie Kray was there, together with a very good friend of mine called Joe Martin. But the Krays had been put in C Wing, which was a special psychiatric wing.
Nowhere was there a wing where there was such a concentration of violent men. And that made for a very heavy atmosphere, because the same 12 mentally disordered patients, prisoners, would see each other each day, and they'd see the same warders. And Ronnie and Reggie complained long and hard that they couldn't have a sensible conversation with anyone. Well, the ring was run by a Dr. Cooper, head of psychiatric services, not only for Parkhurst, but for the whole southwest region. And he tried to give the Krays a bit of leeway. And Reggie said to him, he said, well, look, he said, there's lots of London faces, lots of London criminals we know or we know of. Could we have a visit once a week out on the sports field? And a friend of mine, Kenny Bloom, he came up to me, he said, you've never met them, Norm, but they know you and you know friends of theirs. Would you like to come out and do a visit each week? And that's how I actually met them. But I think Eddie Richardson came out, Kenny Bloom, a couple of other people, and we'd go out on the sports field and spend 2 hours talking about people we knew, all the latest news, the present prison system. I spoke mostly to Ron. And the thing with Ronnie is this, he was the most polite man you'd ever meet in your life. Polite to the point of unctuousness. He believed in politeness. He believed in a man had a duty to behave in a certain way. He'd talk in a little bit of a high voice. Hello, boy. How are you? How's your mum? Do you need anything? You let us know. If you want anything, me and Reg, we'll get it for you. And you'd look at this man and you'd know that behind that very polite facade was a very, very violent guy. And you know of occasions when people had been rude. Not grossly rude, but just say something that was just slightly making fun of them. And normally you'd get a reaction from someone if they're upset. They'd jump up, storm away, say something. Not Ron. Not Ron. He'd just get up, go over to Reg, you know that C, you know what he said? We can't have that. We've got to do something. So he was more the driving force, the dominating force. And Reg, of course, would make one with him and they'd go and do whatever they'd had to do. The one I got on best with was Ronnie, because I chose to speak to him. I think we had 3-4 visits, so I must have spent 6 to 8 hours. I did speak to Reg, but I found him quite a fascinating man, Ron. And also, I think the other people on the visit would rather be talking to Reg. It was easier to talk to Reg. You didn't have to be careful, very careful about what you said. And we found quite a lot of things to talk about. I mean, I mentioned, I've just left Freddie Foreman behind at the Scrubs. Yeah, a good man, Fred. Like this, very much like, I suppose, two plumbers meeting, talking about other plumbers that they know. Amongst the conversations I had with Ronnie told me that he was doing some painting. And he said, I'll give you one of my paintings. So I thought, oh, that's nice. Next time I go out, and I thought to myself, better be a bit careful what I say here. I've got to say something a bit constructive. I don't want to be too critical. And he got out a painting, I suppose it was about a foot by a foot long, and it was just the sort of thing somebody's 3-year-old daughter would do. Unbelievable. Little square houses with yellow lit windows and red roofs. I was so surprised, I didn't say anything, which was probably the most stringent criticism I could have said. But I think whenever you talk of Ronnie, you've got to bear in mind he had a very serious mental illness for all his adult life. I'm not completely sure. I think it was mooted that Ronnie would plead unfit to plead. And I think it got back to them that the prosecution would not accept that case. But you see, it was very political. And a classic example of another political case was the Yorkshire Ripper, Sutcliffe. The Home Office appointed 2 psychiatrists to assess him, and they found he was unfit to plead, but that didn't fit in with what the police wanted or the law wanted, because they don't want the police looking for a lunatic for 13 years. How come they can't catch a lunatic? They wanted a sophisticated, calculating person. And I think it would have been the same outlook with Ronnie. They didn't want a poor, sick man. They wanted the head of probably the most savage criminal gang ever to be known in England. Parkhurst was a really old prison. You look at Parkhurst and you could see that it had drained the youth out of so many young men. It was notorious because in 1969 there was a very bloody riot there. Well, I say riot, it was the warders who rioted. The prisoners, because of brutality, there was organised brutality there. The prison officers, when they got prisoners down the punishment block, would beat the bejesus out of people. The prisoners suddenly decided, rather than being done one at a time, let's have a sit down, which is what they did. And the judge at the trial said the Home Secretary should take a long, hard look at Parkhurst Prison, which was quite a stringent criticism. And because of that, they didn't want any more riots at Parkhurst. So we had a little bit of breathing space. Parkhurst Prison was the end of the line. All the prisoners they couldn't deal with, they sent to Parkhurst. A lot of very, very violent prisoners there. And there were 2 completely separate types of person there. There was the cons in the grey uniforms and the screws, the warders, in the blue uniforms. And never the 2 mixed. The screws just used to talk to the screws, and the cons just used to talk to the cons. There was still some brutality at Parkhurst when I got there, but not the heavy organised beatings like there was before. But Parkhurst was, not so much is now, but was then in 1975, just 5 years after the riot, as a very, very violent prison. And the thing that people don't realise is, every year at the Prison Governors Conference, a governor, a deputy governor or an assistant governor will stand up and say, 1/3 of all my prisoners have got a severe mental illness. Am I running a prison and am I running a hospital? And Parkhurst, it was probably 70% had severe mental illnesses. That's why we were together in a firm. If necessary, if Mike Tyson came there, we'd look at Mike Tyson, and if he did something to us, we'd think, well, okay, this is like a bit of work. Let's do it like a bit of work. And that's what would be done. We'd solve our problem, and it'd send a message to all the other firms, leave them alone, they're quite heavy. We were quite a strong firm. We were all Londoners, probably 8 or 9 of us. And even amongst the Londoners, we were a strong firm. We didn't bother anyone, but we certainly wouldn't have anyone bother us. The Jocks, the Scots, they were quite a strong firm. The Irish were a strong firm. But we could look after ourselves. And it's about survival. Because with all the dangerous people wandering about, the thing that puts them off is that they might get even more violence back than they'd put out themselves. We did think what would ever happen if Ronnie and Reggie came over to the main wing. We sat down and discussed it. We didn't see there being a problem. Reggie, he was pretty much like the rest of us. Ronnie's homosexuality, that wouldn't have bothered us because he would have gone and did what he wanted to do, not in our cells, in his own cell. Well, there were a number of options. You could kill yourself, but my attitude was life was the only game in town. Some people try and get round the staff, grovel round the staff. You couldn't do that in Parkhurst. If you were seen talking to a prison officer, people would shun you. And the same the other round. If prison officers were seen being friendly with the prisoners, other prison officers wouldn't talk to them. There was no parole at Parkhurst. Nobody got parole, which was one of the protests that we had there. Sometimes, to let the steam off, you'd make a bit of homebrew, sugar, yeast, fruit, and get drunk. Absolutely falling down drunk. Not that we were alcoholics, but it broke the boredom. Other people painted. Some people sat down and watched TV. We ran a horse book. We took bets on the horses. We ran a card school. I studied on the Open University to try and keep my head together as much as I could because I knew I was going to do a long time. I knew I was going to do at least 15 years and probably would do more than 20. And you look round for some sort of reference point. And I saw men who'd done 5 years and they were pretty much okay. 10 years, they were pretty much okay. 15 years, some of them were losing it. 20 years, they'd become severely institutionalised. So to me, a fate worse than death was to lose your mind in prison. That's what really focuses prisoners' minds. They don't want to go insane. Ronnie never had to experience the normal prison location. He went straight, after 5 years he was in Broadmoor. So very much a therapeutic environment. And he would have been on whatever medication that he wanted. With Reggie, there's the first 10 years, and every year after 10 years is like 3 or 4 years. That's what I found. My first 10 years went very quickly. I was escaping from this jail, riots there. But then you feel to yourself, this is a liberty to keep me this long. And I went up to 20 years. And every day after 20 years seems more and more of a liberty. They'd previously been in the security wing at Parkhurst. An absolute top security, state-of-the-art prison within a prison. 4 security categories, A, B, C and D. Parkhurst security wing was AA category. And they had my good friend Joe Martin, who, God rest him, he's dead now, who was in for his second murder. It was very boring. The same people would see each other day after day, the same warders would see each other. And there was very much an ebb and flow of existence, if you like. Nothing ever really happened there. All of a sudden, one day, a new prisoner was brought on the wing, a guy called Ronnie and Grantham, a Liverpool guy. He was a thug, pure and simple. His philosophy would be, why should I try and convince somebody to do something when I can bully them and make them do it? And he was doing 10 years. Whilst he was waiting to go to trial, he hit a warder overhead with a bucket of porridge, which is phenomenally heavy, and showered the warder with the hot porridge, and he got more time on top. Then he hit a Scotsman with a hammer, and they put him in the security wing. He wasn't an escape risk, he was just a violent person, and they just thought the calm of the security wing would slow him down a bit. Well, because he was still on punishment, they didn't let him circulate with the other 10, 12 people. They put him in a cell, shut the door. Well, Ronnie is a very proper person who believes a man's got certain duties. So he went round, he collected some biscuits, some jam, some sugar, some tobacco, got the warder to open Grantham's door. Here, mate, here's some goodies for you. Oh, thanks very much. And I'll talk to you through your door. So the door was shut. Ronnie sat down on the doorstep, and I've never heard anyone do this. And he spent 3 or 4 weeks, nearly every single day, sitting on the doorstep, talking to Grantham through the door against the loneliness of solitary confinement. Now, other people knew why Ronnie would do it. Grantham wouldn't have picked up on it. He would have thought, well, I must really have arrived. I've done a screw, a warder, I've hit a Scotsman with a hammer, now I've got Ronnie Krays sitting on my doorstep talking to me. In the end, Grantham's punishment came to an end, and as far as Ronnie was concerned, that's it, he's done his duty. He certainly doesn't want him round him all the time. And also, he had a very restrictive life because he had a very, very bad mental condition. Not to put too fine a point on it, he was certifiably insane. He'd been certified in civilian life, and eventually he gets certified again in Parkhurst. Some days he was so depressed, he'd lie in his cell with a light out for 3 days. The warders wouldn't go near and by him. The only people who would go and see him would be Reggie, his brother, and Joe Martin. So the last thing he'd want is a thicko like Grantham bursting in. But Roy thought, now I'm out, I'll mix with who I like, and kept going in his cell. So the next thing is, Ronnie said to him, Roy, if you don't mind, I'd just like my brother and Joe Martin to come in and see me. I'd be obliged if you didn't come in, but Grantham didn't take a blind bit of notice. So next thing, Ronnie's written a very polite note, Dear Roy, I'd be obliged if you wouldn't come in, and left it on his table. Suddenly, Ronnie and Reg are sitting there having a cup of tea. The door comes flying open. It's Grantham. Who do you think you are? I don't want to fucking speak to you anyway. Stick your fucking note. Threw it at him, walked out. He didn't realise it, but he just made a very, very serious mistake. 1 minute he's in bed dozing, the next minute he's got Ronnie sitting on his chest, slashing his face, Reggie sitting on his legs, slashing his stomach, Neil Addison stabbing him with this harpoon or spear he's made, screams and shouts fill the air. Well, woke Joe Martin up. Joe ran in and could see what was happening. And he told me, he said, Norman, they'd all three completely lost it. He said, especially Ronnie, he was literally like a raving lunatic. He said, I knew they were going to kill him. So Joe grabbed hold of Addison and threw him bodily out the cell, got hold of Reg, said, Reg, we got to stop Ronnie, he's going to kill him. They got hold of Ronnie and calmed him down, and they took him out the cell. Now, needless to say, the warders were nowhere near or by. They were standing well back. They weren't going in. But Joe Martin told me afterwards, he said, Norman, I looked at Grantham and he looked like a butcher's meat. He said, I thought they'd actually killed him. But in fact, he only had superficial wounds because they weren't knives, they were broken bottles. And they took Ronnie and Reggie out the wing. They're really looking at a murder charge, attempted murder charge. But prisons like to consume their own smoke. He went in front of visiting magistrates. They couldn't lose any remission. I think they did a bit of punishment. And then Dr. Cooper took them onto C Wing. And I think they hadn't been on C Wing long when I arrived in the prison. In many ways, Reggie was a victim of Ronnie. Ronnie would kick things off and Reggie would get dragged in with them. Cooper tried to keep them together as long as he possibly could, but even he had to admit the inevitable, and they certified Ron and sent him away to Broadmoor Prison. Ronnie Kray was a long-term mental patient. He'd been in a civilian mental institution. And in Parkhurst, you couldn't have cocaine or heroin or anything like that, but you can certainly have Valium and Largactil and all the other stuff. And they did it because it controlled people. It's a chapter in my book. You see every morning, dinner time, tea time, a queue form. And people go forward and ask for their particular psychotropic drugs. And then they'd amble about, beast-like, through their daily round to get through it. Ronnie, as I understood it, was on very heavy medication. It was said that a guy who was a friend of mine, had his medication by mistake. It took him 3 days to recover. He was unconscious for 2 days and came round on the 3rd day. Ronnie and Reggie Kray had a reputation of being people best left alone. There was a lot of people who didn't want all the notoriety, especially with Ronnie. You had to be very, very careful what you said to him. But a man best left alone, because we can all forget and we can all say things that we think are humorous and funny, and you've really, really upset the man. With Reg, he pretty much had people's respect. He held his head up. He did his time like a man, as best you can do your time over 30 years. But again, he would keep people at arm's length. Otherwise, you'd have a constant stream of mugs coming in and out of his cell driving him mad. 2 types of people would idolise Ronnie and Reggie. Very young prisoners and complete mugs. Very young people because they didn't know enough to realise you just put people off if you're on them all the time. You're either accepted by them or you're not accepted by them. And complete mugs because mugs can only get a bit of respect, not from what they do, but from other people they know. But by being mugs, most notorious people, most sensible criminals, won't have anything to do with them. I only really saw Ronnie and Reggie Kray in Parkhurst. Because of who they are and their notoriety, a lot of people did defer to them. Especially a lot of the staff would defer to them. They weren't disruptive in any way other than the attack on Grantham. They weren't yes men by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't see them when they were all together on a big wing, because they weren't on a big wing. At this time, they were on a little Parkhurst security wing, 12 people, C wing. I did see Charlie Kray coming to Albany, and he had several mugs around him, because he wasn't at all like Ronnie and Reggie Kray. He wanted to get out of prison. He was a good boy. He was behaving himself, trying very hard to get out of prison. Did they have any control? Ronnie got moved to Broadmoor, so it was just Reggie on his own. And Reggie, from what I could gather from Joe Martin, because Joe's used to spend a lot of time. He'd keep to a relatively small group of people. The last thing he wanted was a Kray gang in prison. There were a lot of people who looked up to him. A lot of it was to do with the respect a man's due if he's doing 30 years. If a man's doing 30 years, if a man's doing 20 years, he deserves a bit of respect. Don't give him a hard time. Don't make things any worse for him. And if you can help him, then do. But the terrible thing with Reggie was this. His 30 years wasn't a maximum, and he would have realised that he wasn't going to get out. So in many ways, they tortured Reggie to death. That's why I felt so very, very sorry for Reggie. There's no way you can do 30 years. By the time they brought in the new tariff system back in 1984, I knew, well, I was given a tariff of 20 years, but I'd already done 14 years. And if you can do 14 years, you can do the other 6. But the only trouble is it isn't a minimum tariff. Well, it is a minimum tariff, but it isn't set in concrete. And I ended up doing 24. But once you've done 21, 22, you can do 23, 24, especially by this time I'm in an open prison. An open prison was a commitment to release, so I knew I was coming home. Well, you see, there's always two people when you got somebody famous. There's how they were before they were famous and how they were after they were famous. And sometimes the two are miles and miles apart. A lot of people didn't like what was done to Frank Mitchell. Jack the Hat was a violent man, and when he got killed, people say, well, it goes with the territory. George Cornell, another very violent man, again, went with the territory. A lot of people thought the murder of Frank Mitchell was a liberty. Frank Mitchell was the Hulk before the Hulk was ever invented. Big, massive guy, slightly childish, always fighting with the warders. Well, with the warders, when they jump on you, they jump 7, 8-handed. You got no chance. Not with Frank. He'd shake them off like dogs shaking rats off. And he'd always join in. If he saw a warder having a go at another prisoner, he'd join in. And I was only young at the time. I think I was my first sentence. I was 18, 19 years of age. And people idolised the man. Ronnie and Reggie got him out to put pressure on the Home Office because he was doing a life sentence and he hadn't killed anyone. Supposedly he'd uttered threats against their family and they killed him like a dog. Literally like a dog. He went to get in the back of the van and he was shot in the back of the head, and by all accounts a phone call was made, the dog is dead. Also, there aren't any laws in the underworld. And the underworld is a word I hate to use. It's a stupid word. But you don't rob your own. And yet Ronnie and Reggie, when they heard people had hijacked a lorry or taken this, that and the other, they'd get hold of them, torture them and take their money off them, take the goods off of them. So that's where I mean they took some liberties. Ronnie. Basically, he was mad. Completely mad. Or, a classic example. I didn't personally witness it, but I was told by the firm. Ronnie, it was their West End club, and Ronnie would always stand just in the entrance. And as people come in, Ronnie would say, good evening, how are you, so-and-so. And one night this guy come in, let's call him George, and Ronnie said, hello, George, how are you? And he went, okay, Ron, putting on a bit of weight, mate. Now, that isn't the worst thing in the world you can say to someone, but it was the wrong person to say it to, because Ronnie didn't say anything, he didn't get excited, he just turned round, he walked up to Reg, that slag, you know what he said? We can't have him taking the piss, we've got to do something about it. So they gradually emptied the club. The guy who did it standing up in the bar having a drink. Suddenly the firm, such as they were, grabbed hold of him Ronnie had a big cutthroat razor, and just as deliberately as any surgeon would wield a scalpel, sliced him down both cheeks. And I believe that at the time they afterwards, in very black humour, they nicknamed the guy Tramlines, just like the tram lines running along the street. But, I mean, if you look at the history of Ronnie, some terrible, terrible acts of violence he did. So have I, but not in anything like the amount that Ronnie did. Reggie, when you got Reggie on his own, he was pretty much like all the rest of the London criminals. Very much down to earth, without the heavy duty mental illness that was so obvious in Ronnie. I don't think Ronnie ever did. Ronnie, once he was in, if he'd have been found unfit to plead at his trial, which he should have been, he was a sick man, a very, very sick man, and they made a criminal out of a sick man. He would probably have been released. Certainly after about 20 years. I mean, he died after 20 years. Poor old Reggie, he did 30 years and died. And I think in the latter years it affected his mind. He didn't know what he had to do to get out, but you see, in some ways, they were their own worst enemies. By now, there'd been films made, documentaries made, books written, and what the Home Office, I suppose, were very much worried about was them releasing Reggie, and next thing you know, he's on Panorama, or there's another film, or this, that, and the other. So it would have always been very difficult to let him out. I think people who've been convicted of very serious, very notorious crimes do get people contact them. Even now, with my website, I have quite a lot of people write to me and they want to become friends with me and this, that and the other. So the more notorious people are, the more people want to become friends with them. And that would be especially so with Ronnie and Reggie Kray. So there is a dynamic when notorious people come to a jail, but prison is a great leveller. I used to behave in exactly the same way every wing I walked on. You walk in, you don't talk to people. If there's one or two people you know, you better be sure that they're good, strong people. Maybe you talk to them. And you send a message that if anyone fucks with you, there's going to be some very, very serious trouble. Because a lot of big reputations have absolutely disappeared overnight, where somebody who thought they were a tough guy or was a notorious guy, all paper talk, and they said something to somebody and someone's punched them in the face and put them on their arse, and that's the beginning of a long slippery slope to oblivion and to becoming a laughingstock. When I was visiting Joe Martin in Maidstone prison, in the visiting room was Reggie. He'd have a visit, and he'd always come over and shake my hand, ask me how I was, because in my books, I mean, the story about them attacking Grantham is in my Parkhurst Tales books. And if they were critical, and some of them were, he didn't say a word about it because he knew that it was pretty objective. But he had very busy visits. Other people, you're only allowed 3 people on a visit. He'd have 3, they'd go out, another 3 come in, another 3. It'd become like a celebrity. I think gangster chic is the term they use. The 90s were strange times. Strange insofar as a lot of elderly criminals, notorious criminals, were finishing their long sentences. Long sentences either for murder, armed robbery, and other serious crimes. And to come out at 60, 55 years of age, you don't really want to be jumping over bank counters, robbing banks, robbing security vans. You haven't really got the contacts to smuggle in half a ton of cocaine from Colombia. And so, bearing in mind you've never ever been a worker, they didn't know what to do with themselves. They could see poverty staring them in the face. But all of a sudden, there were certain TV producers, film producers, that could see the kernel of a story. And the criminals picked up on it very, very quickly. Tony Lambriano, God rest him, he's dead now, very funny man. I went on a shoot once and he had them all eating out of his hand. The producer, Tony, what are they? And he said to me, Norman, I've got these people. These are dead easy. But there's only so many stories you can tell. And he said to me, Norman, this is it. This is Gangster Chic. And suddenly you're talking about somebody as if they're the male version of Mother Teresa, when they're not. But I never did believe in Gangster Chic. I believe you've got to tell it as it is. I think it's all about fame. Everybody nowadays, so they say, gets their 15 minutes of fame. It surprises me in America. Serial killers who killed 10, 15, 20 women, and yet lots of people write in and want to become friendly with them. I really think it is they want to try and become notorious by becoming friendly with somebody who's notorious. The original Krays and the Krays brand, two very, very different things. You could be forgiven for thinking the brand Krays were people who went around doing good acts and helping people. Well, maybe they did when they were in prison, but they didn't do that when they were out. For those people who turn around and say the Krays have left a legacy, I can't see it. An interesting story told to me by one of the firm. They said that Ronnie and Reggie were invited out to America. This was a time when the American mob were trying to get gambling rights in England because they were going to put gambling in England. So Ronnie and Reggie go out to New York, and it was said that they were guests of the Brunos, Angelo Bruno family. And you could see what was that they had in mind, the Americans, to explain to their English cousins how you go about things. So Bruno was saying to Ronnie and Reggie, they're in a big restaurant, very nice restaurant. And they said to Ronnie and Reggie, see this tablecloth? Yeah, tablecloth, yeah. All the tablecloths, all the linen in all the hotels have to be laundered in our laundry. Do you see these flowers on the mantelpiece over there? They all have to be bought from our florists. That's the future of organised crime. And never, ever, ever kill anyone yourself. Get somebody else to do it. What did he do, Ronnie? He came straight back to London. He walked in the Blind Beggars and he shot George Cornell stone dead in front of people in the pub. So they didn't learn that lesson very well, did they? One thing you can say about the three brothers, as criminals, they were spectacularly unsuccessful. Charlie died in prison. Ronnie spent 20 years, died in Broadmoor Hospital. Reggie, 30 years, they put him in a hospice. He had weeks to live. He died after 30 years in prison. Not a criminal success story.
We hope you enjoyed this video about life inside Parkhurst Prison with the Krays. For more content on notorious gangsters just like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. I'm Nick from Underworld Uncut. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.